Hey there everybody, Pal here, and welcome back. Today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about stories, mainly stories in video games. I got into this conversation the other day with some other gamers, and they kind of pointed out that when it came to stories, mainly MMOs, I didn't really care about the stories at all, and that I was the type of guy that always skipped through the stories. I never really thought about it, but after some reflection, they were kind of right. This led them to conclude that I dislike stories in general, and that was entirely not true. But there is some truth to the fact that I don't find MMO stories all that enjoyable. And I really wasn't sure why that was. I'd like to deny it, but when I looked at it, I can consider all the MMOs I've played, I've gone through them in my head. Most of the stories I either don't remember at all, or it was just background noise to what I was doing in game. And I think I have an idea of why, and I wanted to share that with you guys because I think it could generate a good conversation, which could generate some channel traffic, which is what I'm all about right there. So let's go down this rabbit hole. So for me, when I look at an MMO, the story is not all that important to me, not because the stories in MMOs are bad, mainly because the pacing of the stories in MMOs is not bad, but terrible. This happens because of a combination of things that come together, forcing the padding out of these stories to ridiculous lengths that they really shouldn't be. If we look at Mists of Pandaria from WoW, and we focus just on that little the story in that expansion, we have two primary themes with kind of a third one interwoven in there. You have the theme of the Pandarians and their manifestation of their own emotions in gluttony, fear. What are all of them? It's gluttony, fear, hatred. But these manifestations come. These emotions manifest themselves into these great beings that are corrupting and destroying their own world. So this is one of the themes that is woven into the game. Then you also have the one of the Alliance versus the Horde and the arrival on this new island, and where they are seeking to gain a foot up on the other as they have this new place of natural resources and so forth, which then culminates in Garrosh Hellscream going mad, becoming corrupted by the Shaws, and in the end goes over to Siege of Ogre-Mire. Then you also kind of have that third one, which is the Calaxi, and I'm not going to go too far into them, but they're involved yet not involved. Their story was never really fleshed out, in my opinion. Now, if we took this story, separated it out, and just focused on it, it would make a fairly good short story. It would make a good 30-40 minute story, you know, little 40 page, 50 page story. And in that focus, I actually kind of liked it. My problem with it came that the beginning of the story started with the release of Miss Pandaria. The conclusion of it came a year and a half later with the end of Siege of Ogre-Mire. And that amount of story was not compelling enough or deep enough to keep me interested over that entire course of the expansion. And this has happened to me many, many times in games. If I look at the story for Burning Crusade, you're going after Illidan, and Illidan this and Illidan that, but it took over a year from the beginning of the expansion just to get to when we were fighting Illidan. And the real story about fighting Illidan wasn't all that great. It was like, he's an evil, he's going to invade, we got to go kill him, grab your sword and let's go. And that is where my disconnect comes. If I could play the story in just a little 90-minute focused gameplay, I'd be very happy. But I cannot stay invested in these minimal characters over such a long time period, especially with so much extra stuff in there. Now, a lot of this stuff in there is a combination of two things. One, MMOs are the new coin-op. They're the new arcades. The big focus of an MMO is to keep people playing day after day, month after month, either subscribing or buying booster packs or whatever, depending on their subscription plan. But they want that $10 a month from their subscribers. So they intentionally pad out the content in order to last as long as possible to keep those people playing. Add on top of that you have the players. I don't know what percentage it is, but we all know these certain players that upon release of new content, they want to be the first ones done. And it's enough that it's noticeable. I would say 10 to 25% of it, of MMO players, as soon as there's new content, they want to see and do anything and everything as quickly as possible. There is no pacing for them. As soon as as soon as a new expansion's out, they want to be the first one to max level. They want to be the first one done with the big raid. So you have what took developers a year to design being eaten up in a week and a half gameplay. And there's no way that any developer could publish content fast enough to keep up with how quickly the consumers eat it up, or at least this part of the consumer base eats it up. So you have intentional gates built into the game in order to slow down player progression, in order to keep content maybe not relevant, but always have enough content there that the next piece of content should be close to ready by the time it's done, and hopefully keep people subscribing. This is done in WoW in several ways. You have the combination, the reputation system, where you can only do so many quests with a certain rep vendor for a certain period in one day. You can only do 5 or 8 quests within one day, and then eventually it'll open up. But basically, it's going to take you, no matter what, 2 weeks of reputation grinds just to finish one faction. They also have this in terms of how they lock out raids. And with the biggest raid, the Siege of Orgrimmar one, and they also did with Throne of Thunder, there was a 4-week or 8-week window. I think it was 8 weeks, because they did one, then there was a week off, a week one off. So they separated it out, that just to get the raid fully released took 8 weeks to happen. And this was smart on them, because let's face it, if they just released it in one day, within 48 to 72 hours, some hardcore guild would have completed the entire raid in that amount of time. So they managed to take what would have lasted, say, 4 days and get it to last 7 weeks instead. So it's on that prospect, it's our own fault. Because the combination of when they want to keep you subscribing, in order to keep you subscribing, they have to keep you so much content, yet the people that are consuming the content are focused on consuming it as quickly as possible, we end up with a lot of this padding in the story. So this story that should have lasted 90 minutes now lasts a year and a half with a lot of fluff. And I just can't be bothered with it. And it's funny because I don't dislike the characters within the story. They're just not compelling enough for me to care over that amount of time. And I get a further disconnect when we're supposed to be saving this world from this manifestation of fear. Yet first I have to go to this farm, and I'm going to spend 30 minutes running around this farm killing rabbits that are stealing this guy's crops. And then I'm going to go down to this brewery, and I'm going to help this guy brew some beer because he wants to get drunk. And I'm all for getting drunk, but not when the world's about to end, because fear itself is now a walking presence killing everybody. So, yeah, MMOs. Now, unfortunately, we have the other end of the spectrum, where MMOs take a solid story and just stretch it out to the point where it's transparent to me. You have not just first-person shooters, but mostly first-person shooters that take a story that could be okay, and they strip out anything that could flesh it out, and they make it one 4-hour roller coaster ride with no pacing at all. Yes, I'm looking at Call of Duty here, but it's just not Call of Duty. It's also Battlefield is doing it, Medal of Honor did it, that Homefront game did it. A lot of the other games are now picking up this, where it seems like they're worried if they take even a moment's respite from the 110% action over the top, that the 14-year-olds with their Mountain Dews and Red Bulls are going to lose interest and turn it off. It's like they're worried about that. So you end up with this non-stop, ever-increasing escalation of pacing that you start to become numb to it. And let's actually look at the horror genre. They're both similar in what happens, but it's a little more obvious in the horror genre. If you play a good horror game, a very good horror game has a combination of the horror element, but it also gives you moments to step back and relax. It gives you safe locations where you're not sitting on the edge of your seat. If you play through a bad horror game, you'll have 6 hours where There is never any break. So for the first 3 hours, you're on the edge of your seat. You're freaking out like, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, what's going to happen? Eventually, you become numb to it. Eventually, you're like, well, nothing's ever changed. So okay, if I die, I die, and you fall back on that horror, that edge of your seat feeling becomes the norm. And once it becomes the norm, it has now failed. Where that becomes the norm is going to be different for every single person. People that play more horror games, it's probably going to kick in sooner than people that don't. But it's going to eventually happen for everyone. Horror games need, in my opinion, there needs to be safe points. Not a lot of them, but safe points where the player can get to and they can just take a deep breath and reflect on what they've been doing before they go back out. So they can sit back and relax, and that offsets it. It actually accentuates the horror side of it when you get back out there. It's almost like in a food, how you mix sweet and savory together, because one accentuates the other one. If it's just pure sweet, eventually you get overwhelmed by sweet. You got to have the two counterbalancing each other. And this happens in horror games. Same thing with action games. If you're always moving at 110%, eventually that becomes the norm and you just become numb to it. A great example of this, an older one, was Half-Life 2, and everyone's always gone back to it, and it's very true. Half-Life 2 had very, very clear moments where you were running at 110% action, everyone's blowing up, and then it would slow down, and you'd have a 15-minute window where you were solving some type of puzzle, or doing some scavenging, or a little sneaky part, and then you were back at 110% for another 20 minutes, and then you were down, and it was this roller coaster ride. But it meant every time that the pacing changed, you noticed it. And you could feel, all right, the pacing has changed now. I don't know how to put this. You could, the high points were that much better because there was a low point on either side of it. So it had a greater impact on you. More recently, I would look kind of at BioShock Infinite. BioShock Infinite had not the best pacing in the world. Towards the end, it kind of went a little too always up. But at least early on, the first half of the game had a very good, nice and slow, and then quick moments of action. And then nice and slow again, then quick moments of action. You'd move into a new area of the city, you spend your time wandering around, trying to find some supplies or whatever, and then all of a sudden someone would get mad at you and you'd be in this big firefight. And then you move on to the next part and you'd have some moments of respite. And it gave you a chance to actually look and appreciate the city you were in. You appreciate this environment that the developers had created. Later on, the game kind of went a little too far to the action side from me personally, but it's a pretty good representation of how you could have leveled it out a little bit to make sure that when the action happens, it happens better. What does this have to do with story? Well, if we look back at the Call of Duty games, name me 4 characters in that game outside of Captain Price and any of the other ones. It's hard to say because there have been different ones and everything, but for the most part, none of the characters mean anything. I believe that on a game like that, the story could really dictate the pacing. They could take moments, little 10-minute windows, where they take a character and they could expand on that character a little bit. And this could be a downtime. Maybe cut back to that guy in an earlier mission, a slower paced mission, to show what he went through that put him in the situation where he's in. And it would develop out these characters, both improving the story, offsetting the pacing, making the overall game both longer, so you wouldn't just have a 4-hour campaign, and more enjoyable in the end. So that's where I think the story in that goes. Now, unfortunately, the MMO side, I don't know of a solution. I don't like to bring up a problem I have with something unless I can offer a solution to that problem. And I've thought about it, I cannot think of one for an MMO. An MMO is stuck in a place right now where the cost of designing them is just so much that they have to pad that content, they have to slow down the players. Unless players decide, you know what, I don't need to rush through this, I don't see any way that they can do the story in a better manner. The only thing I can think of would be, rather than one big overarching story, have each zone or little 5-hour window of the game have one concise story that begins and ends within that zone. And they've tried that in some places. Normally you have the overarching story, then you have the zone stories, but those tend to always be done with B characters that have no importance in the overall theme of the game, and they're just forgettable to me. To other people, they might not be forgettable. I also would point out that there's one other problem that happens with these stories that where you're always saving the galaxy, always saving the universe, always saving everything. It's hard to make a low point in that story because the stakes are so high. And I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier with the saving the rabbits or saving the garden from the rabbits and everything. When everything in all of creation is at stake, how can I spend a little bit of time off doing these mundane tasks when I should be out saving the world? How can I spend all this time? Why are you making me grind rep for a week before you're going to sell me those shoulder pieces that could be the difference between me winning? I'm asking this to the NPC now. Between us surviving and us failing. Don't you want to live? Give me the damn shoulder pads. And I suppose that could be me nitpicking, but I've noticed this Mass Effect was a great example of this. Where the story, the overarching story, was complete and utter assimilation and destruction of all species within the universe. Yet we spent so much time babysitting these characters that we got to know because of we had to flesh out their stories and make them like us. And it's strange because I really liked like Mordin Solus. He's one of the best written characters I've seen in a video game in a long time. He's funny, he's engaging, he's just witty, and he was greatly done. But when the stakes were everything, spending a little bit of time collecting him some samples to possibly save a few hundred people from a disease, well, I guess it's a few million, but you get the idea, seems minuscule. If you come across a bunch of, in an MMO, you come across a bunch of people that are starving, well, okay, I can go out and I can waste 3 hours getting you guys food and bring it back, and that would be on its own a good deed. Except those 3 hours lost could mean the difference between me saving and us failing at saving everybody. When the stakes are so high, it's very hard to make smaller parts of the story feel important. And I think that is another part. So there you have it. There's my thoughts on storytelling in video games, the goods, the bads, why I can't really get into MMO stories, what my issues are with them. If you have any thoughts, leave them in the comments. I'd love to hear back from you guys. This has been Paller. Thanks for watching.